I'm super excited to have everyone here this morning for our panel on joint ventures that work for supportive housing. This panel is co-sponsored with CSH and Goldstein Hall. I will hand it off to David to give us an overview of joint ventures and their structure.
So there's some tips I always like to say, right, when you're doing a joint venture. One is, you should know your partner, right? So who are you dealing with? Like, if you were going out there, you should do some research, talk to people and find out who you're dealing with, because everyone has a reputation. If they don't have a reputation, that may be more troublesome. If they haven't been working in this field, and maybe they have never worked with a supportive housing client, that should give you some pause. Another important tip, everything should be in writing. If there's any communication that's a major deal point, you want them to send it to you, even if it's in an email, that's writing, believe it or not, no emojis, but it should be in writing, and you should make sure that you've consulted with your attorney or your board to make sure that this is what you want to do and that you have the authority to agree to that. What is your mission as a nonprofit, right? And that's really important at the end of the day. Your mission-driven entities, organizations. Private developers may say they're mission-driven, they are to extent, but they do have a bottom line that's important. For you as an organization, you're mission-driven and your job is to serve your clients, your customers, people who you are servicing. And the question is the deal that you're getting involved in, that deal? Are you servicing your mission? Why would a for-profit want to venture with you as a nonprofit, right? That's something that we're hinting at. There are certain sites or funding programs that, as we talked, that's specifically Jennifer's talking about, is that nonprofits have access to, that make a project work, right? So there may be a public site that's being RFP'd, but it's there's a requirement that a nonprofit be involved with it, right? Some sites have that. There are still funding streams, specifically supportive housing, require a nonprofit to be involved. The funding to come through a nonprofit, so that's really important. That's why for-profit's looking at you. The political support. A lot of times on the ground, you may have the better relationships with the community people, the community board, the council person, or even the borough president. Not all private developers are actually involved in all the local community boards, and the word private developer may scare. Other things that are really important, I think, that people forget also for a nonprofit is some of the things that a nonprofit brings is the tax abatement on a lot of projects. In particular, a 420C tax abatement. Some of you may have heard of that. That's a tax abatement that if a nonprofit has a majority interest, it's a tax credit deal. At least 70% of the units are tax credit eligible. You can get 0%. There'll be no taxes on the project as per the length of the regulatory agreement. That's a major way a project works nowadays. You don't have to pay real estate taxes. Nonprofits can create an HDFC, or nonprofit HDFC that gets you exemption from mortgage recording tax. A nonprofit can bring sales tax exemption to the table so that you don't have to pay for on new construction, purchase of goods and materials. That's another big savings. At the end of the day, you bring a lot to the table. Roles and responsibilities, decision making. That to me is kind of one of the big points. Who's making decisions? And what are you agreeing? As I said in that example, some decisions can be jointly made, require both parties to consent. Some decisions are not. A joint venture cannot work that way, that everybody has to make the same decision. But if someone is going to be responsible for making the decision on the construction financing, then the question is, shouldn't you have the right to be in the decision-making process, the right to be consulted, the right to have a say, and some sort of right at the end of the day to say, maybe not a total veto, but at least you need my parent authority to go ahead. if you're not involved in the process about who the tax credit syndicator is, where you're going to get the funding, you will definitely be getting less money at the end of the day. I guarantee you that. If you're an organization, you should, and you don't have the ability to run the numbers yourself, you should select and demand that you select a project consultant who you trust and have comfort with to run the numbers. There are a lot of great consultants out there, some are here in the room, and they will help you frame and put the project together. That may not be your expertise, it's the first time. You want someone on your side running the numbers. And then finally, I would say is the end of the project, year 15. Who's in a tax credit deal at the end of 15 years, the syndicator exits the project. That's one of your partners in the project. They'll exit. Who's taking over the project at that point? You should know your partner. I'm going to stop and leave it at that.
Yeah, no, that was excellent, David. Thank you so much.
So we've actually done 22 projects, and half of those have been some form of a joint venture. Mike's usually the first person I call when somebody sends me a site, because and we've joint ventured with Olympic as a partner. They assembled an incredibly difficult site. It took years, and then they asked us to come in, and so we brought in the financing from OMH and 4% credits and so forth. That was several years ago. We've been looking at sites together, but we haven't really. We're renting office space from them for our social service team, so it's worked out well. And as you said, it's somebody you trust, and we developed a good feeling about working with him. We're trying to do most of these deals ourselves now, and what Olympic and what Martin were able to do was assemble a site, and that's what we didn't have the capacity to do. And so we formed a real estate task force of our board, I'm a member of, and began educating, I think, high net worth individuals about opportunities in this industry and how safe these deals are. And the kinds of, I think, the problems we've had mostly been with the nonprofit partners, and I think that there's when you go into a deal and you have this tenant mix, and our tenants are coming from the shelters, they have a history of mental illness, so maybe they're not perfect tenants. So the first thing that, something goes wrong and they're asking us to get rid of the tenant. And we say we don't get rid of tenants. That's the whole point of this exercise, is to keep people in housing. So that creates a type of friction. So some of the deals we're the social service provider and the nonprofit is the property manager. So we try to avoid those when we can.
In looking at a potential partner, like David was saying, we do our research on them. We look at their financials. We ask around, reputation-wise, and just try to kind of feel things out. Meet with the people that we would be working with, meet with their boards, and see if you could play well together in the sandbox. Sometimes you determine that you won't play well together, and you go on your separate ways. But more often than not, you can find a common ground. But I would say I agree with what David said in terms of figuring out your deal on the earlier side, because we've definitely done it both ways, where the joint venture agreement is kind of a concept that's being developed as the project is being developed, and you're like, oh yeah, make a note of that, and that'll go into the joint venture agreement. And I have to say, comparing that to getting everything on paper and decided on the earlier end is much nicer, because then you can look back at that document as you're in the middle of all of the closing madness, and you're like, oh, we already decided that, and there's no questions, and there aren't as many negotiations happening when you're negotiating with everybody else. So I highly recommend getting your T's crossed and your I's dotted on the earlier side. And also, I think by going through that process, that's another way of determining, can we work together? Because there's a lot of tough questions, there's a lot of decisions that have to be made, and sometimes you can discover early on that like this is going to be a deal breaker, and you can stop wasting everybody's time. I would say as many decisions that you can get out of the way earlier, the better. I think definitely before you start borrowing money and spending a lot of money is a good point in time at which to do that.
We are definitely seeing a lot more from our end, people coming to us with joint ventures, a lot of nonprofits and even a lot of affordable housing bringing deals to us. And I think the number one thing we always ask as the minute we start hearing about a joint venture is why. You know, an investor, a syndicator wants to know why this is a joint venture and why you cannot do it on your own. And I think that's always a really good question to ask yourselves when you're going into a partnership. And I think at times, and it goes from both sides, nonprofits, affordable housing, for-profit developers as well, have certain notions that they bring, like they're the bigger, or they're the ones, or they're whatever. And I think it's always important that the developers go back and ask themselves, why is it that I need this person? Is it maybe for a site? Wonderful. And not to forget though that whatever the other individual is bringing or entity is bringing is also just as valuable. I think a lot of in these joint ventures, until they come, they're kind of going down this path of, oh, this is wonderful, you have the site, we can get financing, but they haven't had the conversation of who makes that final choice, who gets the money at the end, who takes on ultimately the full risk of this project. Because at the end of the day, not, you know, you guys are in a partnership, meaning the entities, the partners, but you know, the investor, the syndicator is also in this partnership long term, and we want to make sure that the project is sustainable, and we want to make sure partners are working and thinking about the nuances of what's going to come in the future. As you're talking about partnerships, as you're presenting your partner, your project to investors and syndicators, is to kind of taking the moment to ask, why do I need this partner? What are they bringing to the table, and who's truly taking the risk? And also the understanding of decision making, right? I think that's been kind of a thread here. We've all talked about it, and because we want to know is the decision maker at the table, and whoever's at the table understands how are the decisions going to be made. At the end of the day, it goes back to risk for the partners involved. I think again, you know, what are you taking on and what do you want? And not to forget that, I mean, maybe you haven't done a development project in a long time, but you know, nonprofits have multiple contracts they manage all the time. You know, I don't see the same on other, you know, non-for-profit developers. So, you know, don't sell yourself short, I guess. That's what I always like to say, particularly when I'm talking to nonprofits.
This has been a great conversation. Please join me in welcoming, thank you. Our panelists.